and welcome. Today, we're going to dive deep into something that's, well, a really big deal for our planet. A global agreement to save our oceans. It's a fascinating story about trade, the environment, and a huge debate about what's fair for everyone involved. So let me ask you a question that sounds kind of crazy at first. Are we actually paying to empty our own oceans? It gets right to the heart of this massive tangled problem. See, every single year, governments around the world spend billions on something called fisheries subsidies. And here's the paradox. A huge chunk of that money actually encourages overfishing. It pushes fish populations right to the edge of collapse. So, yeah, in a way, we're literally funding the very problem we say we want to solve.
Okay, so how in the world do we fix this? Here's the game plan for our explainer today. First, we're going to look at the historic deal that's designed to stop this madness. Then, we'll break down exactly how it's supposed to work. We'll also see who the biggest spenders are, dig into why a major country like India hasn't signed on yet, and finally, we'll talk about what's truly at stake for all of us.
All right, first things first, the solution. After more than 20 years of negotiations, just think about that. 2 decades. The world finally has the WTO Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies. And this isn't just some report that's going to sit on a shelf. It's a landmark, legally binding global agreement designed to, quite literally, turn the tide. So this deal was officially adopted way back in 2022. But the big date to circle on your calendar is September 15th, 2025. That's the date officially kicks in and becomes law now that 2/3 of the WTO members have given it the green light. The clock is officially ticking. And what's really amazing here is the history that's being made. This is the first time, ever, that the World Trade Organization, the group that sets the rules for global trade, has created an agreement that's squarely focused on environmental sustainability. It's a huge step forward, connecting the dots between our global economy and the health of our planet. Okay, so we know it's historic, but what does this deal actually do? Let's get into the nuts and bolts. The agreement is really designed to be like a surgical tool, zeroing in on the specific subsidies that cause the most harm to our oceans. Now, before we go any further, there's a key term you've got to know. IUU fishing. It stands for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Basically, you can think of it as the black market of the high seas. These are the practices that happen in the shadows, wrecking marine life with absolutely no oversight. And here's the most crucial part. The agreement bans government funding for those exact activities. Countries can no longer hand out subsidies that support that illegal IUU fishing, or subsidies for fishing stocks that are already dangerously low, or for fishing out on the unregulated high seas where it's basically a free-for-all. But the agreement also gets that not every country is starting from the same place. It includes something called special and differential treatment. It's a fancy term, but what it means is that it gives developing and the least developed countries a 2-year grace period to adjust to these new rules. It's a recognition that they have their own unique challenges. Which, of course, brings us to a really critical question. If we're going to fix the problem, we have to know where it's coming from. So, who are the biggest spenders when it comes to these harmful fisheries subsidies? Well, the data shows that the money is heavily concentrated. Just 5 players, that's China, the European Union, the US, South Korea, and Japan. Together, they account for a whopping 58% of all these subsidies worldwide. Now, let's put that into perspective, because this is where the story gets really interesting. On one side, you've got those top 5, who are responsible for the lion's share of the subsidies. And on the other side, you have a country like India, a nation with a massive coastline, a huge fishing sector, and yet it's one of the lowest fisheries subsidizers in the world. This massive contrast is really at the heart of the whole debate. And that contrast right there leads us to the most complex part of this story. India, a really critical player in all of this, has not yet signed on to the agreement. And its reasons all boil down to this fundamental debate about fairness and historical responsibility. This quote pretty much sums up India's entire position. The argument is simple. The nations that historically contributed the most to the problem of overfishing, they should be the ones to take on a bigger responsibility for fixing it. And they should do it without putting an unfair burden on developing nations, where fishing is often done on a small, sustainable scale. So this stance is built on 3 key ideas. First, the polluter pays principle. Pretty self-explanatory, right? If you made the mess, you should pay to clean it up.
Second, this concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. The idea that, yeah, we're all in this together, but some have a bigger role to play. And third, the absolute need to protect the livelihoods of millions of traditional small-scale fishers. And based on those principles, India has raised some very specific points. It proposed a 25-year timeout on subsidies for nations that send their massive fleets to fish far, far from their own shores. It also argues that the agreement is too focused on the total dollar amount of subsidies, and it ignores the per-person figures, which would tell a very different story. And it says the deal doesn't really account for the reality of countries that have huge coastal populations who depend on the sea to survive. So with this really complex debate going on in the background, what is actually at stake here? The answer is pretty much everything. Seriously, we're talking about the health of our oceans, global food security, and the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of people around the world. But look, if this agreement can succeed, if we can get it right, the potential benefits are just immense. We could actually see vital fish stocks begin to recover. We could see a global shift toward fishing practices that are truly sustainable. And we could protect a critical source of food for communities everywhere. The upside is absolutely enormous. At the end of the day, as the agreement itself says, this isn't about one country pointing fingers at another. It's supposed to be a common effort, a collective moment where we all recognize that the health of our oceans is completely tied to our shared future on this planet. And that leaves us with the final and most critical question of all. The goal is clear and the need is incredibly urgent. But the path forward really hinges on our ability to answer this. Can we create a global solution that not only protects our oceans, but also guarantees a critical source of food for communities everywhere? The upside is absolutely enormous. At the end of the day, as the agreement itself says, this isn't about one country pointing fingers at another. It's supposed to be a common effort, a collective moment where we all recognize that the health of our oceans is completely tied to our shared future on this planet. And that leaves us with the final and most critical question of all. The goal is clear and the need is incredibly urgent. But the path forward really hinges on our ability to answer this.